the President of the United States reaches the state of Kentucky on his cross-country speaking tour. Under a dazzling sun which beats upon the sprawling grandstands of Latonia Race Track, some 25,000 people now await the address of the nation's chief executive, who spoke this morning in Ohio and entered Kentucky scarcely more than 15 minutes ago, as the big 10-car presidential special train crossed the Ohio River from Cincinnati and rolled to a stop at a siding near Covington, Kentucky.
My friends of Kentucky, I am glad to come to this beautiful spot today. I know about Latonia by reading the sporting pages of the paper.
Among the thousands of citizens that packed Latonia Race Track that steamy July day was Cincinnatian and former Latonia stable boy James Robertson, who had brought his 10-year-old son to not only see the president, but to show him Old Latonia, for he knew the track's days were numbered. He told him the stories of the famous jockeys and legendary racehorses that ran on those grounds. But most importantly, he said, it was the people. The people made Latonia what it was. As the president finished his speech, Robertson put his hands on his son's shoulders and said, "Boy, this was America's most beautiful race course." For as long as I can remember, I've loved horses. I was born in 1890, not too far from Latonia Springs, on a horse farm, no doubt. Now, my father taught me everything there was to know about history in the area, like Latonia Springs Hotel and their grand ballroom, and their medicinal springs where anybody who was anybody came to visit. It was run by Dr. Moser, who bought the place in the 1840s and turned it into a first-class facility. Dr. Moser named the resort after the Greek goddess of water, Latonia. If you were a member of high society in the mid-19th century, you went to Latonia Springs. When Dr. Moser passed, the place was sold and eventually closed down. But the name Latonia would be born again when Northern Kentuckians Judge Cleary and Colonel Nelson and business associates formed the Latonia Agricultural Association in 1882 and purchased 109 acres of land from the James Taylor estate between Taylor Mill Pike and the Cincinnati and Lexington Railroad tracks. Their dream was to build a first-class horse racing facility, and they did just that. By the end of May of 1883, the track was complete with a 400-foot grandstand and a beautifully manicured infield, and eventually a man-made lake. The famous John G. Carlisle visited the track and said it was the finest racing facility he had ever seen. A few days later, former President Rutherford B. Hayes toured the facilities and was equally impressed with what the owners had done. On Saturday, June 9, 1883, 8,000 fans crammed into the New Latonia Race Track to witness the first races. The very first race at Latonia was won by a horse named Markland. The feature event was won by a horse named Leonatus. The race was called the Hindu Stakes, which would later become the Latonia Derby, and it was won by the famous Isaac Murphy, who would go on to win 3 Kentucky Derbies and 5 Latonia Derbies in his Hall of Fame career. Latonia Race Track was off and running. Word spread quickly that Latonia had the best jockeys, the top horses, and was a beautiful racetrack. And betting the horses at Latonia became a favorite pastime in greater Cincinnati. With the financial success of Latonia, the owners were able to keep improving the track, including building a beautiful Victorian clubhouse. Like my father told me, old Dr. Moser never could have guessed that his name Latonia would be read in newspapers all over the country. By 1893, electric streetcars would begin service to Latonia. And boy, did it make a difference in attendance. Thousands upon thousands would come out to Latonia, and it seemed like every year a new attendance record was set. And by the turn of the century, the Latonia Derby would rival the Kentucky Derby in Louisville. In 1903, my father moved us to Cincinnati, and I saw my first race at Latonia. I don't remember who won, but I do remember the people, lots of people. After the races, my father and I stopped at a saloon on DeCourcy Pike, and that's where I heard the Latonia Rag. That day, I fell in love with Latonia, and on the way home, my father gave me a crash course in horse racing. He talked about all the jockeys and all the horses that had come to Latonia. I knew right then and there I had to get a job at Latonia Race Track. Well, in 1905, I finally got that job at Latonia, making 50 cents a day, helping people to their seat, cleaning stables, doing landscaping, whatever they needed. I got to meet all the jockeys, including Jimmy Winkfield, who once gave me $5 to carry his bags. And then there was old Mrs. Russell, the widow, who would give me a portion of her winnings for helping her out. Unfortunately, she didn't win very often. But the highlight for me that year was getting to within a few feet of Alice Roosevelt herself. I had quite a big crush on Princess Alice, as she was called. And when she came to the Latonia Derby with her future husband, Mr. Longworth, I couldn't keep my eyes off of her. I was hoping to get the chance to say hello to Miss Roosevelt, but she had a special crew that was taking care of her at the track. I didn't have the seniority yet. By the middle of the decade, the automobile had come into its own, and that just meant more people coming to the track. It also meant auto racing, which I fell in love with instantly. There was something about the sound of those engines and the dust and the dirt. I loved everything about it. So you can imagine how happy I was when Latonia got auto racing. I had followed all the automobile racers in the paper, and working at the track meant that I would get a front row seat to all the action, including the famous Barney Oldfield. I secretly wished I didn't have to work during the auto races, because I wanted to just sit back and watch the racers go. They were amazing to me. The Latonia auto races were a big hit, and the crowds were large. It was quite the success. It was so successful, in fact, that Latonia officials had plans to build an automobile raceway in Rosedale, which sat along the Licking River not too far from the racetrack. It was to be called Rosedale Speedway, and efforts were led by Latonia Mayor J.T. Earl. It was to be one of the first pure automobile racetracks in the country. The group purchased 65 acres next to Lake Walking. And in 1909, construction was well underway when the fledgling American Association, a minor league baseball outfit, told them to halt production because they may want to put a baseball field on that land. Well, it never happened, and neither did Rosedale Speedway. Besides automobile races, air shows became all the rage across the country. In the fall of 1909, the famous Curtis and Willard brought their flying machines to Latonia Race Track. Fortunately, I didn't have to work the event, but I went down there anyway because I wanted to see what these flying machines were all about. And boy, am I glad I did. Those air machines were amazing. One of the planes even did 2 loops around the Holy Cross steeple. And I got to shake hands with the famous Orville Wright, who was in town to lend his advice at the Latonia Air Show. And I finally got my chance to say hello to Alice Roosevelt. And I also got to see history, as Cincinnati pioneer newspaper woman Ruth Neely became the first woman to ever fly solo in an air machine, even though it was only a few feet off the ground. It was spectacular. Latonia had become so popular that in 1912 Hollywood came calling, and they made a movie about the Latonia Derby. I saw winning the Latonia Derby 8 times, including once with my sweetheart on our first date. Her name was Rose, and she would eventually become my wife. She must have thought I was crazy to see the movie that many times, but it was so neat to see Latonia on the big screen. By 1919, I had left my job at Latonia Race Track. It was time for me to get a real job and start a family. So I started work at the mill in Cincinnati, and that same year, Latonia was sold to the same folks that had Churchill Downs under their belt. Now in charge of Latonia was Colonel Matt J. Wynn. Colonel Wynn would now be in charge of both Churchill Downs and Latonia, and the next decade was something to behold. During the 20s, I might not have worked at Latonia, but I went down to the racetrack as often as I possibly could. My home might have been in Cincinnati, but my hometown was Latonia. All of my friends were at Latonia. John, George, Big Dave, and of course all of the L&N railroad workers that I had befriended at the track. And of course, I'd always stop in Eimer's Garden for music, food, and to dance with the wife. The popularity of Latonia Racetrack was at an all-time high, and the popularity of the Latonia Derby surpassed even the Kentucky Derby at Churchill Downs. And the track was as beautiful as it had ever been. The purses were bigger, the crowds were larger. There was no doubt that this was the golden age of Old Latonia. In 1927, I missed my first Latonia Derby in 24 years. Rose was with child, and I had to stay home and take care of her. But when she fell asleep, I snuck over to our neighbor, Mr. Hopper's house, to listen on the radio on station WLW. It wasn't as good as being at the track, but it was pretty close.
Broadcasting to you from the grandest of tracks, Latonia Race Course in Latonia, Kentucky, on station WLW. It's a warm summer day, and it is a special day. 25,000 fans have packed the place to witness a day of racing with the finest horses in the country. The 6 horses in today's field are at the post. And there they go, they're off! Jock and Buddy Bauer are out front, with Handy Mandy snuggling in behind. Jock and Buddy Bauer are tight, neck and neck on the rail, and Jock takes the lead by half a length. But here comes Dolan, with War Eagle right behind. Jock ahead by half a length over Buddy Bauer. Handy Mandy is making her move. Look at her go. Boys, it's a horse race. Handy Mandy coming up on the outside. She's gaining. She's in the lead. Down the stretch, Handy Mandy. 2 lengths ahead. 4 lengths ahead. And Handy Mandy wins. Handy Mandy, her first win, and it's a new record. 2:28.35. That is amazing, boys. That beats Man O' War's record. 1/5 of a second faster than Man O' War, the horse of the century.
I jokingly gave Rose a hard time about missing that race for years, but it was worth it because James Jr. was born not long after that. In 1931, Latonia shined on the big screen once again, in Clark Gable's first ever starring role. The movie was called Sporting Blood and featured scenes of Latonia Racetrack. When the Depression hit, it hit hard, and not even Grand Latonia could escape its wrath. Poor old Latonia became a ghost town. It was tough to get the great jockeys and great horses, and even tougher to get great crowds. Old Colonel Wynn tried night racing, starting races at 4:30 in the afternoon so factory workers and the like could come down to the track. It worked for a little while, but it wasn't enough.
Then I'll go, or you'll know.
The last race at Latonia ever was July 29th, 1939. I wasn't going to go, but something told me I should be there. James Jr. and I hopped in the car and drove down to the track. We got there just in time to see Catalonia cross the finish line, the last horse to ever win a race at Old Latonia. And on the way home, James Jr. got to see his old man cry for the first time.
For you know, you must be weary.
The last big event they'd hold at Old Latonia was the Kenton County Centennial in the summer of 1940.
Till we meet again someday.
Fittingly enough, the event started by Eleanor Roosevelt pushing a ceremonial button at the White House. And in the spring of 1942, the Latonia Race Track was no more, bought by an oil company and torn down. They had asked me to come down to the track to be a part of the wrecking crew, but I couldn't do it. I had already said my goodbyes to Old Latonia and wanted to remember it like it was, America's most beautiful race course.
When a lad I stood one day by a cottage far away, and to me that day all nature seemed more grand. For my Sue with blushes red had just promised we should wed, and I'd come to ask her mother for her hand. As I told the old tale of a love that ne'er would fail, the gray-haired mother stroked her daughter's hair, and I fancied I could trace just a tear on her kind face as she placed my sweetheart's hand in mine and said, she was bred in old Kentucky, where the meadow grass is blue. There's the sunshine of the country in her face and manner too. She was bred in old Kentucky. Take her, boy, you're mighty lucky when you marry a girl like Sue. She was bred in old Kentucky, where the meadow grass is blue. There's the sunshine of the country in her face and manner too. She was bred in old Kentucky. Take her, boy, you're mighty lucky when you marry a girl like you.